Celebrity chef's voice boomed across the pristine kitchen of Le Bernardin as Isabella Martinez wiped down the last table of her section, her black, non-slip shoes squeaking against the polished floors. Chef Antoine Dubois had just announced his impromptu cooking challenge to the staff, his French accent dripping with condescension as he declared that American cuisine lacked soul and sophistication. The 29-year-old waitress kept her head down, focusing on the repetitive circular motions of her cleaning cloth, but every word felt like a deliberate insult to everything she had once dreamed of becoming. Isabella had been working at this upscale Manhattan restaurant for 3 years, invisible to most of the clientele who saw her only as a vessel for their expensive meals. Her uniform was always impeccable: crisp white shirt, black vest, hair pulled back in a neat bun, but underneath the professional exterior was a woman whose culinary passion had been buried under layers of financial necessity and broken dreams. She carried herself with quiet dignity through the endless shifts, serving plates she could create better versions of in her sleep, if anyone had bothered to ask. The kitchen staff gathered around Chef Dubois like disciples, hanging on his every word as he explained how he would demonstrate the superiority of classical French technique over what he called the crude simplicity of American cooking. His pale blue eyes swept dismissively over the servers who had dared to linger near the kitchen entrance, and Isabella felt the familiar sting of being categorized as unworthy of culinary conversation. The sous chefs nodded eagerly, their white coats pristine and their egos inflated by association with the visiting celebrity. Behind her composed facade, Isabella's mind wandered to the small studio apartment where she practiced techniques learned from her late grandmother, a woman who had run an underground restaurant in her Miami neighborhood before Isabella was born. The flavors of her childhood lived in her muscle memory, the perfect balance of acid and heat in a mojo sauce, the delicate layering of spices in a traditional sofrito, the patience required to develop depth in a proper Cuban black bean stew. These were tastes that had shaped her palate long before she ever heard of molecular gastronomy or foam. Flavors that carried the weight of generations and the stories of people who cooked with love rather than fame. The evening service had been particularly brutal, with several demanding tables and a kitchen running behind schedule. Isabella had smoothly handled every crisis, anticipating needs before they were voiced, remembering dietary restrictions without notes, and maintaining her professional smile even when a particularly arrogant businessman had snapped his fingers at her like she was a dog. Her feet ached from the 12-hour shift, but she had perfected the art of moving efficiently while appearing unhurried, a skill that served her well in the high-pressure environment of fine dining. As she finished her closing duties, Isabella overheard the kitchen staff discussing Chef Dubois's background, his 3 Michelin stars, his appearances on international cooking shows, his reputation for reducing grown cooks to tears with his brutal critiques. The man commanded respect through fear rather than inspiration, and the servers whispered about his legendary temper tantrums and his habit of publicly humiliating staff members who failed to meet his impossible standards. Yet everyone seemed mesmerized by his presence, as if proximity to celebrity might somehow elevate their own status in the culinary world. Isabella's thoughts drifted to the small notebook hidden in her locker, filled with her grandmother's handwritten recipes and her own modifications developed through years of experimentation. Abuela Carmen had taught her that cooking was about more than technique. It was about understanding the story each ingredient wanted to tell, about respecting the traditions that had survived through centuries of hardship, about creating comfort and joy through the simple act of nourishing others. These lessons felt revolutionary in a kitchen obsessed with complexity and presentation, where emotional connection to food was often dismissed as unprofessional sentimentality. The restaurant's general manager, Michael Torres, had noticed Isabella's work ethic over the years, but seemed oblivious to her culinary knowledge. He appreciated her reliability and her ability to handle difficult customers, but he had never asked about her background or interests beyond her availability for shifts. To him, she was a valuable employee in the same way a well-functioning piece of equipment was valuable, essential, but unremarkable. Worthy of decent treatment, but not worthy of deeper consideration or investment. As the last customers filtered out into the Manhattan night, Isabella caught fragments of conversation about Chef Dubois's challenge, scheduled for the following evening when the restaurant would be closed to regular service. The staff seemed divided between excitement and terror at the prospect of being judged by such a renowned figure. But Isabella felt something different stirring in her chest, a mixture of anger and anticipation that she hadn't experienced in years. The dismissive way he had spoken about American cuisine felt personal, as if he had insulted not just her heritage but every immigrant grandmother who had adapted traditional recipes to new ingredients and new circumstances. The kitchen began to empty as the night crew finished their cleanup, but Isabella lingered longer than usual, her eyes taking in details she had noticed countless times before, the professional-grade equipment that could execute techniques she had only dreamed of attempting. The vast array of specialty ingredients that represented a cookbook's worth of possibilities, the organized efficiency of a space designed for culinary excellence. She had memorized every inch of this kitchen through 3 years of careful observation, noting which burners ran hot, which ovens had temperamental thermostats, which prep stations offered the best workflow for complex dishes. Her phone buzzed with a text from her roommate asking about her shift. But Isabella barely registered the message. Something had awakened in her that felt both foreign and familiar, like rediscovering a language she had once spoken fluently but had been forced to abandon. The challenge Chef Dubois had proposed was meant to be a demonstration of his superiority, but Isabella found herself wondering what would happen if someone actually rose to meet it, not with submission or hero worship, but with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your own worth. The last of her coworkers filed past her toward the employee exit, chattering about their plans for tomorrow night and speculating about which lucky kitchen staff member might be chosen to participate in the chef's demonstration. Isabella remained motionless, her cleaning cloth forgotten in her hands, staring at the empty kitchen that suddenly seemed full of possibilities she had never dared to consider. The familiar weight of resignation that had settled on her shoulders over the past 3 years began to shift, replaced by something that felt dangerously close to hope. As she finally gathered her things and headed toward the staff exit, Isabella made a decision that would have surprised everyone who saw her as just another invisible service worker. Tomorrow night, she would be present for Chef Dubois's challenge. Not as a passive observer, but as someone ready to remind him that great cooking had never been about fame or credentials. It had always been about soul, tradition, and the courage to honor both while creating something entirely new. The following morning arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to mirror the tension building inside the Bernardin's walls. Isabella had barely slept, her mind churning through possibilities and memories of flavors she hadn't dared to recreate in years. She arrived for her shift 2 hours early, using her keycard to enter the empty restaurant, where the morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the dining room she knew better than her own apartment. The familiar ritual of setting up her section felt different today, charged with an energy that made her hyper-aware of every detail. Chef Dubois had arrived even earlier. His presence immediately felt throughout the building as he conducted what could only be described as an inspection tour, with the head chef and general manager trailing behind him like nervous assistants. Isabella watched from a distance as he ran his finger along surfaces checking for dust, opened reach-in coolers to examine the quality of ingredients, and made notes in a small leather notebook with the precise movements of a surgeon documenting a procedure. His expression remained neutral. But the staff's anxiety was palpable as word spread that he had already identified several areas of improvement in their operation. The kitchen staff moved with unusual precision throughout the morning prep. Their normal casual banter replaced by focused silence punctuated only by the sound of knives against cutting boards and the occasional whispered consultation. Isabella noticed that several of the line cooks had arrived early as well. Their usual confidence replaced by nervous energy as they prepared for an evening that could either elevate their careers or devastate their professional reputations. The sous chef, Marcus Rodriguez, kept glancing toward the dining room where Chef Dubois held court with management. His jaw tight with the kind of stress that came from having one's life's work suddenly subject to expert scrutiny. During the lunch service, Isabella found herself paying unusual attention to the conversations at her tables, particularly when diners mentioned the evening's special event. Word had somehow spread through the city's foodie network that Chef Dubois would be conducting a demonstration at Le Bernardin, and several regular customers made pointed comments about their disappointment at not being invited to witness what they assumed would be an educational showcase. Isabella served and cleared plates with her usual efficiency. But part of her mind remained focused on the challenge that awaited, turning over flavor combinations and techniques like worry beads. The afternoon brought a delivery of specialty ingredients that Isabella had never seen in the restaurant before: exotic spices, rare vinegars, artisanal salts, and vegetables she recognized from her grandmother's stories but had never worked with personally. She watched from the service station as Chef Dubois examined each item with the intensity of a scientist reviewing experimental data, occasionally making approving nods or disappointed shakes of his head. The kitchen staff gathered around these ingredients like students studying for a final exam, trying to anticipate what knowledge they might need to demonstrate their worthiness. Isabella's section was unusually slow for a Thursday afternoon, giving her time to observe the subtle changes in the restaurant's atmosphere as word of the evening's event spread among the staff. The servers whispered about which kitchen workers might be selected for the challenge, most agreeing that Marcus would likely be chosen as the restaurant's representative. The busboys speculated about whether they would be allowed to watch, while the hostesses debated the career implications for whoever participated. Through it all, Isabella remained silent, her professional smile masking the growing conviction that tonight would change everything. As the last lunch customers departed, Isabella retreated to the employee break room where she finally allowed herself to examine the emotions that had been building since yesterday evening. The notebook in her locker seemed to pulse with significance, its pages containing not just recipes but the accumulated wisdom of a woman who had understood that food was the most honest form of communication between cultures. Isabella's fingers traced the worn cover as she remembered her grandmother's hands guiding hers through the delicate process of tempering spices, the patient explanations about how flavors developed and combined, the stories that turned simple ingredients into carriers of history and identity. The arrival of the evening shift brought fresh energy and new speculation about the challenge's format. Isabella learned through kitchen gossip that Chef Dubois had requested access to the restaurant's entire inventory of ingredients, from the most basic pantry staples to the most expensive specialty items. He had also insisted on using only equipment available in the current kitchen, dismissing suggestions that additional tools might be brought in for the demonstration. This detail struck Isabella as significant. He wanted to prove his superiority using the same resources available to everyone else, which meant technique and knowledge would matter more than access to exotic equipment. The dining room was reconfigured during the evening setup, with several tables moved to create an open space facing the kitchen's pass window. Chairs were arranged in rows like a classroom, and proper lighting was installed to ensure clear visibility of the cooking process. Isabella helped with these preparations while mentally cataloging every detail that might become relevant later, from the angle of the lights to the acoustic properties of the space. The transformation felt ceremonial, as if the restaurant was being prepared for a ritual that would determine not just cooking skill but fundamental understanding of what food could represent. Chef Dubois emerged from his afternoon preparations wearing a fresh white coat that seemed to glow under the restaurant's lights, his bearing suggesting complete confidence in whatever demonstration he had planned. He surveyed the reconfigured dining room with the satisfaction of a general reviewing troops before battle, occasionally adjusting the position of a chair or requesting modifications to the lighting setup. His attention to these details revealed a performer's understanding of how environment influences perception, and Isabella realized that tonight's challenge would be as much about theater as it would be about cooking. The kitchen staff had been dismissed from regular duties 2 hours before the normal dinner service, giving them time to shower and change into fresh uniforms for the evening's event. Isabella used this break to center herself, practicing breathing techniques her grandmother had taught her for managing performance anxiety during the busy holiday seasons when their small family restaurant served 3 times its normal capacity. She thought about the stories behind the recipes in her notebook, the resilience and creativity they represented, the generations of cooks who had faced their own forms of dismissal and doubt while continuing to honor their culinary traditions. As the appointed hour approached, the invited audience began to arrive: local food writers, culinary students, industry professionals, and a carefully selected group of the restaurant's most valued customers. Isabella recognized several faces from her years of service, people who had never bothered to learn her name but who would witness whatever unfolded tonight. The irony was not lost on her that she might finally be seen by people who had looked through her for years, though under circumstances she could never have anticipated. The staff assembled in the dining room with the nervous energy of performers before a show, their usual hierarchy temporarily suspended by shared anxiety about representing their restaurant well. Isabella positioned herself near the back of the group, close enough to see everything clearly but far enough away to avoid unwanted attention. Her heart rate had steadied into the focused rhythm she remembered from cooking for large crowds, a state of alert calm that allowed maximum awareness of multiple simultaneous processes. Tonight, she would need every skill she had ever developed, both as a cook and as someone who had learned to observe without being observed. Chef Dubois took his position at the front of the assembled crowd, his presence commanding immediate attention and silence. The kitchen behind him gleamed under the specialized lighting, every surface cleaned to perfection and every tool arranged with military precision. Isabella could feel the collective held breath of everyone present as they waited to learn exactly what form this challenge would take, and whether any of them possessed the knowledge and courage necessary to meet it on equal terms. Chef Dubois began his presentation with the theatrical flair of someone accustomed to commanding attention on international stages, his voice carrying easily through the reconfigured dining room as he outlined what he described as a fundamental test of culinary understanding. The challenge would be simple in concept, but devastating in execution. 2 cooks would be given identical baskets of ingredients, high-quality proteins, fresh vegetables, and pantry staples, and tasked with creating a complete dish in 45 minutes that demonstrated not just technical skill, but genuine understanding, a flavor harmony, and cultural authenticity. The catch, delivered with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, was that one basket would contain ingredients primarily associated with classical French cuisine, while the other would feature items he dismissively categorized as typical American fare. Isabella felt her stomach tighten as Chef Dubois elaborated on his theory that American cuisine lacked the sophistication and historical depth necessary for truly exceptional cooking, relying instead on what he called immigrant adaptations of superior European techniques. His words carried the casual cruelty of someone who had never considered that adaptation might require more creativity and skill than simple repetition of established methods. The assembled audience, food writers, culinary students, and restaurant patrons nodded along with his assessment, seemingly mesmerized by his confidence and reputation rather than evaluating the validity of his claims. The selection process for the restaurant's representative became a humiliating spectacle as Chef Dubois dismissed candidate after candidate with increasingly harsh critiques of their qualifications and experience. Marcus, the sous chef, who everyone had assumed would be chosen, was rejected for having attended culinary school in Phoenix rather than a prestigious European institution. 2 line cooks were dismissed for lacking classical training, while another was deemed too young to possess the depth of experience necessary for such a demonstration. Isabella watched this systematic degradation of her colleagues with growing anger. Recognizing the deliberate psychological warfare designed to ensure that whoever was eventually selected would already be demoralized and defensive. The kitchen staff shifted uncomfortably as Chef Dubois continued his elimination process. Their initial excitement about participating in a prestigious culinary event rapidly transforming into dread about being publicly humiliated by someone whose reputation could destroy careers with a single dismissive comment. Isabella noticed that the audience seemed to be enjoying the drama, treating the selection process as entertainment rather than recognizing the real professional stakes involved for the restaurant's employees. The power dynamic was stark and ugliest. Celebrity chef wielding his reputation like a weapon against working cooks whose livelihoods depended on maintaining respectability in a small and gossip-driven industry. When Chef Dubois announced that none of the kitchen staff met his standards for the demonstration and suggested that perhaps the restaurant's management should reconsider their hiring practices, Isabella felt something snap inside her chest, like a tightly wound spring suddenly released. The casual dismissal of people she had worked alongside for years, people whose skills and dedication she witnessed daily, crystallized into a rage that burned away 3 years of learned invisibility and professional submission. Before she could second-guess herself, she stepped forward from her position at the back of the room, her voice cutting through the uncomfortable silence with surprising clarity and strength. She volunteered to represent the restaurant, her words delivered with the calm confidence that comes from having nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The announcement sent a ripple of shock through the assembled crowd. Servers weren't supposed to cook. Waitresses weren't supposed to have opinions about cuisine, and no one was supposed to challenge Chef Dubois's authority over his own demonstration. Isabella felt the weight of every stare in the room, from the incredulous expressions of her coworkers to the bemused smirk of the celebrity chef who clearly viewed her intervention as either a joke or an opportunity for even more dramatic humiliation. Chef Dubois's initial amusement quickly transformed into something colder as he began his interrogation of Isabella's qualifications. His questions designed to expose her presumption and return her to her proper place in the restaurant's hierarchy. He demanded to know her training, her experience, her understanding of basic culinary principles. Each question delivered with increasing hostility, as if her very presence in this conversation was an insult to his expertise. Isabella answered each query with factual brevity, neither defensive nor apologetic, her responses revealing a depth of knowledge that surprised everyone present while carefully avoiding any details that might explain its source. The general manager, Michael Torres, attempted to intervene and remove Isabella from consideration. clearly panicked about the potential consequences of allowing a server to participate in what was supposed to be a showcase of the restaurant's culinary capabilities. His protests were overruled by Chef Dubois, who had apparently decided that publicly defeating a presumptuous waitress would provide even better entertainment than crushing a qualified cook. The celebrity chef's ego had been pricked by Isabella's calm confidence, and he wanted the satisfaction of not just winning but demonstrating the absurdity of her challenge through overwhelming superiority. The basket selection process revealed Chef Dubois's strategy with crystalline clarity as he magnanimously offered Isabella's first choice between the two prepared ingredient collections. The French basket contained pristine proteins, luxury items, and ingredients that practically announced their intended preparations: duck breast, foie gras, chanterelle mushrooms, aged cheeses, and classical aromatics that could be combined into elegant dishes following time-tested methods. The American basket appeared deliberately challenging by comparison, filled with what seemed like humble ingredients: a whole chicken, root vegetables, dried beans, cornmeal, and spices that most classically trained chefs would struggle to elevate beyond rustic comfort food. Isabella examined both baskets with the thoroughness of someone who understood that this choice would determine not just the evening's outcome, but possibly her entire future in the culinary world. She could see the trap being laid: take the French basket and compete with Chef Dubois using techniques he had perfected over decades, or accept the American ingredients and attempt to create sophistication from elements he had deliberately chosen for their perceived limitations. The audience waited in expectant silence, most probably anticipating that she would make the safe choice and select the obviously superior French ingredients, thereby acknowledging the hierarchy Chef Dubois had established. Instead, Isabella reached for the American basket with decisive confidence, her choice sending another wave of surprise through the watching crowd. Chef Dubois's expression shifted from amused condescension to something approaching respect for her boldness, though his smile suggested he viewed her decision as either admirable courage or spectacular foolishness. The ingredients in her chosen basket seemed to pulse with possibility as Isabella's trained eye catalogued their potential, not as limitations to overcome, but as a language she had been fluent in long before she ever heard of molecular gastronomy or foam reductions. The formal rules were established with military precision: 45 minutes on the clock, access to the restaurant's full pantry for additional seasonings and basic ingredients, but no assistance from other staff members, and no communication with the audience during the cooking process. Each cook would prepare a complete dish that demonstrated their understanding of flavor, technique, and presentation, with judging to be conducted by the assembled food writers and industry professionals. Isabella felt the familiar pre-service adrenaline beginning to build in her system as she mentally organized her approach, her grandmother's voice echoing in her memory with reminders about patience, respect for ingredients, and the importance of cooking with intention rather than desperation. As the kitchen was prepared for the challenge and cameras were positioned to capture every moment of the competition, Isabella caught her reflection in the polished surface of a stock pot and barely recognized the woman staring back at her. 3 years of invisible service had trained her to minimize her presence, to anticipate needs without being noticed, to solve problems without taking credit. Tonight, she would need to reclaim a part of herself that had been dormant for too long. The cook who understood that food was conversation, that flavors could tell stories more complex than any cookbook, and that true skill lay not in following established rules but in understanding them well enough to transcend them completely. The timer's electronic beep cut through the restaurant's silence like a starting pistol, and immediately the kitchen transformed into a theater of controlled chaos as both competitors began their 45-minute race toward culinary vindication. Chef Dubois moved with the fluid efficiency of someone who had performed variations of this dance thousands of times. his hands already breaking down the duck breast with surgical precision, while his eyes scanned the available pantry ingredients for the classical accompaniments that would showcase his technical mastery. Isabella stood motionless for several precious seconds, not from uncertainty, but from the deep breathing her grandmother had taught her. Center yourself first. Understand your ingredients, then move with purpose rather than panic. While Chef Dubois commanded attention with his dramatic knife work and authoritative movements around the kitchen, Isabella began her preparation with what appeared to be deceptive simplicity, gently handling each ingredient from her basket as if greeting old friends after a long separation. The whole chicken received particular attention as she examined its weight, skin quality, and the promise of flavor contained within its compact form. The watching crowd murmured their confusion at her methodical approach, expecting the frantic energy typically associated with timed cooking challenges. But Isabella had learned from years of family cooking that haste was the enemy of depth, and that understanding always preceded action. Chef Dubois had already begun rendering fat from the duck skin, filling the kitchen with rich aromas that drew appreciative murmurs from the audience. While simultaneously preparing a reduction that would demonstrate his mastery of classical French sauce work, his movements were textbook perfect, each technique executed with the precision that had earned him international recognition, and the assembled food writers began taking notes about his professional methodology. Isabella seemed almost primitive by comparison as she began breaking down her chicken with careful attention to preserving the integrity of each piece. Her knife work, less showy but equally effective as she separated joints and trimmed skin with the economical movements of someone who had learned to waste nothing. The first sign that Isabella's strategy might be more sophisticated than initially apparent came when she began building what appeared to be a sofrito base, her movements suddenly becoming more fluid and confident as she worked with ingredients that spoke to her in a language older than formal culinary training. The aromatic foundation she created filled her corner of the kitchen with scents that were simultaneously familiar and exotic, drawing curious glances from staff members who had never associated such complex flavors with their usually invisible colleague. Chef Dubois paused momentarily in his own preparation, his professional instincts recognizing the sophistication of what she was building, even as his conscious mind dismissed it as rustic improvisation. The watching audience began to divide into factions as the competition progressed, with most remaining confident in Chef Dubois's inevitable victory, while a smaller group found themselves inexplicably drawn to Isabella's quieter but increasingly confident approach to her ingredients. Food writer Margaret Chun noticed that Isabella's technique revealed training that seemed both classical and completely unconventional, as if she had learned fundamental principles from sources that existed outside the traditional culinary education system. The general manager, Michael Torres, shifted nervously in his seat as he realized that his employee was demonstrating capabilities he had never suspected, raising uncomfortable questions about how many other talents he might have overlooked in his staff. Isabella's transformation became more apparent as she moved deeper into her preparation, her body language shifting from the deferential posture of a server to the confident bearing of someone who belonged in this kitchen as much as anyone who had ever worked there. She seasoned her chicken pieces with a spice blend that seemed to emerge from memory rather than measurement. Each addition tasted and adjusted with the instinctive precision that comes from understanding flavors at a molecular level. The cornmeal from her basket began its own transformation as she worked it into what appeared to be developing into a sophisticated polenta, but with additions and techniques that suggested influences far more complex than simple Italian tradition. Chef Dubois maintained his commanding lead in terms of visual spectacle, his duck breast achieving perfect color while his sauce reduced to glossy perfection that caught the camera lights like liquid amber. His plating had already begun to take shape in his mind, each element positioned according to classical principles of balance and proportion that had been refined over centuries of French culinary tradition. The food writers continued their documentation of his technique, several noting that his performance demonstrated why French cuisine maintained its position as the pinnacle of sophisticated cooking. Though a few began to pay closer attention to the increasingly complex aromas emerging from Isabella's corner of the kitchen, the midpoint of the challenge brought unexpected drama as Isabella's dish began to reveal its true complexity. Her humble ingredients transforming into something that defied easy categorization while remaining rooted in techniques that predated Chef Dubois's classical training by generations. The beans from her basket had been cooked with aromatics that created a broth so rich and complex that it drew involuntary appreciation from kitchen staff, who had been assuming her dish would be little more than elevated comfort food. Chef Dubois found himself glancing more frequently toward her station, his professional instincts recognizing sophistication even as his ego refused to acknowledge any real threat to his dominance. Isabella's chicken began its final cooking phase in a method that combined techniques from multiple traditions, the meat developing flavors that seemed to intensify rather than simply brown, while her polenta achieved a consistency that suggested understanding of texture and timing that couldn't be improvised under pressure. The watching crowd began to sense that something unexpected was developing. The most still assumed that presentation and final execution would favor the celebrity chef whose reputation had been built on precisely these kinds of high-pressure demonstrations. The kitchen filled with competing aromas that told different stories about the relationship between technique and tradition, between performance and authenticity. The final 15 minutes brought visible stress to Chef Dubois's previously unshakable confidence as he realized that Isabella's dish was not only holding its own, but might actually be developing flavors more complex than his own carefully executed classical preparation. His movements became slightly less fluid, his attention divided between his own plating and the disturbing realization that a servera, waitress, was creating something that challenged his fundamental assumptions about hierarchy, training, and culinary worth. Isabella remained focused on her own work, but her growing confidence was palpable to everyone watching, as if she was remembering not just recipes, but an entire identity that had been suppressed for too long. The audience sensed the shift in momentum even before the cooking was complete, conversations dropping to whispers as they recognized that what they had expected to be a demonstration of established superiority was becoming something more unpredictable and potentially revolutionary. Isabella's transformation from invisible server to confident cook had been so complete that several diners who had been served by her countless times struggled to reconcile this assured presence with the woman who had quietly delivered their meals without ever drawing attention to herself. The timer continued its relentless countdown toward a conclusion that no one in the room was prepared for. Least of all, the celebrity chef who was beginning to understand that his presumptions about American cuisine and the people who practiced it might have been dangerously naive. With 20 minutes remaining on the clock, Isabella's dish began to transcend the limitations that everyone, including Chef Dubois, had assumed were inherent in her ingredient selection, revealing layers of complexity that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between simplicity and sophistication. Her chicken had been broken down and prepared using techniques that drew from multiple culinary traditions while remaining true to principles her grandmother had taught her about respecting the integrity of each ingredient. The transformation was subtle but undeniable, as humble components elevated each other through careful timing and an understanding of flavor development that seemed to bypass conventional culinary logic. Chef Dubois's concentration wavered for the first time as the aromas from Isabella's corner of the kitchen began to compete seriously with his own carefully orchestrated duck presentation, creating a sensory dialogue that forced everyone present to reconsider their preconceptions about American cuisine's potential for refinement. His sauce, while technically perfect, suddenly seemed predictable compared to the complex layering of flavors that Isabella was building through what appeared to be improvisation, but was actually the application of knowledge systems that existed outside the formal culinary education he had assumed was necessary for sophisticated cooking. The food writers noticed his momentary hesitation, several noting that the celebrated chef seemed unsettled by developments he clearly hadn't anticipated. Isabella's polenta had achieved a consistency that spoke to deep understanding of corn's potential for sophistication, its texture smooth and luxurious while maintaining the robust flavor that marked it as distinctly American rather than attempting to mimic European preparations. She folded in additions that seemed to emerge from instinct herbs that complemented rather than dominated, aromatics that enhanced the grain's natural sweetness, and a final enrichment that brought richness without heaviness. The watching kitchen staff exchanged glances of surprise and growing respect as they recognized techniques they had never seen before, but which clearly represented sophisticated understanding of ingredient relationships. The bean component of Isabella's dish revealed itself as perhaps the most revolutionary element, as what had appeared to be simple legumes had been transformed into something that functioned simultaneously as protein, sauce, and flavor foundation for the entire plate. Her preparation method drew from traditions that predated classical European cuisine while achieving refinement that met any reasonable definition of fine dining standards. Chef Dubois found himself studying her technique between his own preparation steps, his professional pride warring with genuine curiosity about methods he had never encountered in his formal training or subsequent career. As the final quarter of the challenge began, Isabella's confidence reached a level that transformed not just her cooking, but her entire presence in the kitchen, her movements becoming fluid and assured as muscle memory took over from conscious thought. She seasoned and adjusted her dish with the intuitive precision that comes from understanding flavors at a fundamental level, tasting and correcting with micro-adjustments that spoke to years of experience translating traditional techniques for contemporary palates. The watching audience began to shift their attention more equally between the two competitors, sensing that the outcome was far less predetermined than they had initially assumed. Chef Dubois's plating began with his characteristic attention to visual perfection. Each element of his duck preparation positioned according to classical principles that had been refined over centuries of French culinary tradition. His technique was flawless, his presentation sophisticated, and his flavors precisely balanced according to standards that had earned him international recognition and 3 Michelin stars. Yet somehow the certainty of his victory had evaporated as Isabella's dish continued to develop complexity that couldn't be explained by her apparent qualifications or the humble nature of her chosen ingredients. The transformation in Isabella herself became as compelling as the food she was creating, as 3 years of learned invisibility gave way to the natural authority of someone who had always belonged in professional kitchens, but had been forced to deny that identity for economic survival. Her knife work revealed training that couldn't be improvised under pressure. Her understanding of timing demonstrated experience with complex, multi-component dishes, and her instinctive seasoning adjustments showed palate development that typically required years of conscious cultivation. Michael Torres watched his employee with growing amazement and concern, realizing that he had fundamentally misunderstood not just Isabella's capabilities, but possibly her entire background and qualifications. Food writer Margaret Chun began documenting what she increasingly recognized as a story more significant than a simple cooking competition, noting that Isabella's technique represented a sophisticated synthesis of traditional methods with contemporary applications that challenged conventional narratives about American cuisine's limitations. Her preparation methods seemed to draw from multiple cultural traditions while remaining coherent and purposeful, suggesting knowledge that extended far beyond casual home cooking or basic culinary training. The other journalists present began to sense that they might be witnessing something historically significant rather than merely entertaining. Isabella's final adjustments to her dish revealed the depth of planning that had underlies her seemingly improvisational approach. Each component designed to complement and enhance the others in ways that created flavor combinations impossible to achieve through simple addition of ingredients. Her understanding of texture, temperature, and timing demonstrated sophistication that equaled anything in Chef Dubois's classical preparation while offering complexity that felt both innovative and deeply rooted in tradition. The kitchen staff watched with growing admiration and disbelief as their colleague, the quiet waitress they had worked alongside for years, demonstrated mastery that rivaled anyone in their professional circle. Chef Dubois's supremacy, which had seemed inevitable at the challenge's beginning, now appeared vulnerable as Isabella's dish approached completion with an assurance that spoke to comprehensive understanding of her chosen techniques and ingredients. His classical training and international reputation provided him with technical excellence, but Isabella's preparation offered something he couldn't match, the kind of authentic connection to culinary tradition that comes from growing up within it rather than studying it as an academic subject. The audience sensed this shift in momentum, conversations dropping to whispers as they recognized that their assumptions about hierarchy and expertise were being systematically dismantled. The final minutes approached with both competitors focused intently on their finishing touches, but the energy in the room had shifted dramatically from the challenge's beginning. What had started as an expected demonstration of established superiority had become a genuine competition between different approaches to culinary excellence, different definitions of sophistication, and different relationships to tradition and innovation. Isabella moved with the calm confidence of someone who had found her way home after a long exile, while Chef Dubois worked with the focused intensity of someone who realized his reputation might depend on the next few crucial minutes. The timer's relentless countdown towards zero carried weight that extended far beyond a simple cooking challenge, marking moments that would determine not just the evening's winner, but potentially the future course of Isabella's career and the assembled audience's understanding of what constituted legitimate culinary expertise. The kitchen had become a battlefield where different philosophies of cooking, different definitions of authenticity, and different claims to professional authority would soon be judged by palates that had arrived with firmly established expectations about who deserved respect and recognition in the culinary world. The final timer's shriek pierced through the kitchen's tension like a blade cutting silk, and both competitors stepped back from their completed dishes with the exhausted satisfaction of artists who had given everything to their craft. Chef Dubois's presentation was a masterpiece of classical French technique, the duck breast sliced to reveal perfect rose-colored interior, fanned artfully alongside roasted vegetables that had been turned with textbook precision. The rich sauce pooled strategically to catch the light and demonstrate its glossy perfection. His plate spoke the visual language of fine dining that food critics recognized immediately. Each element positioned according to principles refined over centuries of French culinary tradition. Isabella's finished dish seemed almost shockingly humble by comparison, arranged on the plate with careful attention to balance and proportion, but without the architectural drama that typically characterized restaurant presentation. Her chicken had been broken down and prepared in a style that defied easy categorization, neither purely rustic nor formally refined, but something that transcended those artificial boundaries entirely. The polenta formed a creamy foundation that supported components whose relationships to each other seemed both inevitable and surprising, while the bean preparation provided richness and depth that transformed the entire composition into something greater than the sum of its individual parts. The judging process began with Chef Dubois's dish, and the initial reactions met his expectations as food writers and industry professionals recognized and appreciated the technical excellence of his preparation. His duck achieved the perfect balance of crispy skin and tender meat that marked professional-level execution, while his sauce demonstrated the kind of classical technique that had earned him international recognition. Several judges nodded approvingly as they tasted, their comments focusing on the precision of his cooking times, the sophistication of his flavor combinations, and the visual appeal that made his plate immediately photographable for magazine covers and social media posts. When the judges moved to Isabella's plate, the initial reaction was more subdued, as if they were uncertain how to approach something that didn't fit their established categories for evaluating fine cuisine. The first bites were taken with the polite attention typically reserved for competent but unremarkable food, the judges' expressions suggesting they were prepared to offer diplomatic praise for a valiant effort that had exceeded expectations without threatening established hierarchies. Margaret Chun was among the first to recognize that something extraordinary was happening as the initial flavors gave way to deeper, more complex layers that revealed themselves slowly and demanded reconsideration of everything that had come before. The transformation in the judges' responses was subtle at first, marked by longer pauses between bites, more thoughtful chewing, and increasingly focused attention to the food rather than to their note-taking or to each other. Isabella's dish seemed to unfold in stages, each component revealing relationships to the others that hadn't been apparent in the initial tasting, creating a experience that deepened rather than simply satisfying hunger or providing immediate gratification. The polenta that had seemed simple revealed itself as a sophisticated foundation that enhanced rather than competing with the other elements, while the chicken preparation demonstrated understanding of flavor development that couldn't be achieved through technique alone. Food writer James Morrison, whose reviews had shaped culinary careers throughout the Northeast, found himself returning repeatedly to Isabella's plate with growing amazement as he recognized flavors and techniques that challenged his fundamental assumptions about American cuisine's sophistication and historical depth. The bean preparation in particular revealed itself as a masterpiece of complex layering. Its richness derived not from heavy cream or butter, but from patient development of natural flavors through methods that seemed to draw from multiple cultural traditions while remaining completely coherent as a unified dish. His professional palate, refined through decades of evaluating the world's finest restaurants, struggled to categorize what he was experiencing. Chef Dubois watched the judging process with growing unease as he recognized the subtle but unmistakable signs that Isabella's dish was generating, responses his own classical preparation had not achieved. The judge's body language shifted from polite appreciation to genuine engagement, their conversations becoming more animated as they attempted to identify and discuss flavors that seemed familiar yet completely novel. His supremacy, which had seemed inevitable throughout the cooking process, began to feel uncertain as professional food critics demonstrated the kind of enthusiasm typically reserved for genuine culinary discoveries rather than competent execution of established techniques. The audience of restaurant staff, food industry professionals, and regular customers found themselves drawn into a conversation that extended far beyond simple preference or technical evaluation, as Isabella's dish forced reconsideration of assumptions about sophistication, authenticity, and the relationship between formal training and genuine understanding. Kitchen workers who had prepared thousands of meals found themselves discussing flavor combinations they had never encountered, while diners who had eaten at the world's finest restaurants struggled to categorize an experience that seemed both completely American and utterly sophisticated, rooted in tradition, yet completely contemporary. Isabella herself stood quietly at the edge of the judging area, her expression calm, but her eyes bright with the satisfaction that comes from finally being able to demonstrate capabilities that had been suppressed for too long. The dish she had created represented more than technical skill. It was a statement about the sophistication possible within American culinary traditions, about the knowledge contained within communities that fine dining typically overlooked, and about the difference between copying established techniques and understanding the principles that made those techniques effective. Her transformation from invisible server to recognized culinary artist was complete, but the implications extended far beyond personal vindication. The moment of final judgment arrived with electric tension as the assembled critics and industry professionals struggled to articulate responses that challenged their own professional vocabularies and established criteria for evaluating culinary excellence. Margaret Chun spoke first, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose opinion could make or break careers throughout the culinary world. As she attempted to describe an experience that had forced her to reconsider fundamental assumptions about American cuisine's potential for sophistication and international significance. Her words carried weight that extended far beyond the evening's competition, marking a shift in understanding that would ripple through the food world. Chef Dubois listened to the judge's comments with growing recognition that his assumptions about American cuisine, about formal training requirements, and about the relationship between reputation and actual skill had been systematically dismantled by someone he had dismissed as fundamentally unqualified to participate in serious culinary conversation. The humiliation was profound but educational, as his professional palate was forced to acknowledge that Isabella's dish achieved levels of complexity and satisfaction that his own technically perfect preparation could not match. The evening that was supposed to demonstrate his superiority had become a lesson in the dangers of prejudice and the overlooked sophistication of traditions he had never bothered to understand. The room fell silent as the implications of the judging became clear to everyone present. The celebrated international chef had been outcooked by a waitress whose qualifications existed completely outside the formal systems that typically determined culinary authority and recognition. Isabella's victory was absolute and undeniable, marked not just by superior flavor, but by the kind of comprehensive understanding that comes from authentic connection to culinary tradition rather than academic study of established techniques. The world had shifted, hierarchies had been overturned, and assumptions about who deserved recognition and respect in the culinary world would never be quite the same. The silence that followed the judges' unanimous declaration stretched through the reconfigured dining room like the pause between lightning and thunder, pregnant with implications that extended far beyond a simple cooking competition. Isabella stood motionless as the reality of her victory settled over the assembled crowd. Her expression calm, but her eyes reflecting a mixture of vindication and relief that came from finally being seen and recognized for capabilities she had carried quietly for years. The transformation was complete. The invisible waitress had become an undeniable culinary force whose achievement could not be dismissed, explained away, or attributed to luck. Chef Dubois faced the most significant professional humiliation of his career, as food writers and industry professionals who had witnessed his defeat began to process the implications of what they had experienced. His classical training, international reputation, and 3 Michelin stars had been insufficient to compete with knowledge that existed outside the formal systems he had assumed were necessary for culinary excellence. The defeat was absolute and public, witnessed by precisely the audience whose opinion mattered most in determining professional standing within the culinary community. And there would be no opportunity to minimize or recontextualize the outcome. Margaret Chun approached Isabella with the focused attention of a journalist who recognized that she was documenting a story that would reshape conversations about American cuisine, formal culinary education, and the hierarchies that determined who received recognition and opportunity within the food world. Her questions revealed genuine curiosity about Isabella's background, training, and the sources of knowledge that had enabled her to create something that challenged fundamental assumptions about sophistication and authenticity. The interview that followed would launch Isabella's career while simultaneously forcing the culinary establishment to confront its own blind spots and prejudices. The restaurant's general manager, Michael Torres, struggled to reconcile the confident, accomplished cook he had just witnessed with the quiet, efficient server he had employed for 3 years without ever recognizing her potential. His failure to identify and nurture such extraordinary talent reflected poorly on his management skills and raised uncomfortable questions about how many other capabilities he might have overlooked among his staff. The conversation that would follow in his office would result in immediate changes to Isabella's position, compensation, and responsibilities, but also in broader policy changes designed to better recognize and develop employee potential. Kitchen staff members who had worked alongside Isabella for years approached her with mixtures of admiration, embarrassment, and curiosity about the background she had kept private throughout their professional relationship. Line cooks who had assumed their formal training made them superior found themselves reconsidering their own assumptions about expertise and asking for opportunities to learn from someone they had previously dismissed as irrelevant to serious culinary conversation. The kitchen's hierarchy had been permanently altered, with Isabella's knowledge and skills now recognized as resources that could benefit everyone's professional development. The assembled food writers and industry professionals began crafting narratives that would introduce Isabella to the broader culinary world, while simultaneously examining the systemic issues that had kept her talents hidden for so long. Restaurant reviews, feature articles, and industry analyses would explore themes of overlooked expertise, cultural bias in culinary education, and the sophisticated traditions that existed within communities typically ignored by fine dining establishments. Isabella's story would become a catalyst for broader conversations about diversity, opportunity, and recognition within the food industry. Within weeks, Isabella's life had transformed beyond recognition as offers arrived from restaurants, television networks, publishers, and culinary schools seeking to capitalize on her newfound fame while providing platforms for her to share knowledge that had previously been confined to family traditions and personal practice. The cookbook deal that emerged would focus not just on recipes, but on the stories and techniques that connected contemporary American cuisine to its diverse cultural roots, offering readers access to sophisticated traditions that had been overlooked by mainstream culinary education. The restaurant itself benefited enormously from the attention Isabella's victory had generated, with reservations booked months in advance by diners eager to experience the establishment where such an extraordinary culinary revelation had occurred. Isabella's new role as executive chef brought immediate changes to the menu, incorporating techniques and flavors that challenged customers' expectations while maintaining the sophistication they demanded from fine dining experiences. Her success attracted talented cooks who wanted to learn from someone whose knowledge existed outside traditional culinary hierarchies. Chef Dubois's professional reputation recovered slowly as he acknowledged the validity of Isabella's victory and began incorporating lessons from his defeat into his own teaching and cooking practice. His experience forced a public reckoning with assumptions about cultural superiority in cuisine and the value of formal training versus authentic tradition. The humility he was forced to develop improved both his cooking and his relationships with students and staff, though the memory of being outcooked by a waitress would forever remind him of the dangers of prejudice and presumption. Isabella's success inspired servers, cooks, and food service workers throughout the country who recognized that their own hidden talents and suppressed knowledge might deserve recognition and development rather than concealment for economic survival. Culinary schools began developing programs to identify and nurture talent from non-traditional backgrounds, while restaurants implemented policies to better recognize and develop employee potential, regardless of their current positions or formal qualifications. The broader impact of Isabella's victory extended into conversations about immigration, tradition, and the sophisticated knowledge systems that exist within communities often dismissed by mainstream American culture. Food writers and cultural critics began examining how economic lucres talented individuals to suppress their capabilities while working in service positions, and how the loss of that knowledge impoverished American cuisine as a whole. Isabella's story became a symbol of resilience, hidden excellence, and the transformation possible when talent finally receives the recognition it deserves. Years later, Isabella's restaurant empire would span multiple cities. Her television shows would educate millions about the sophisticated traditions that existed within American cuisine, and her foundation would provide culinary education and opportunities for talented individuals from backgrounds similar to her own. The waitress who had been invisible for 3 years had become one of the most influential voices in contemporary American cooking, proving that excellence could emerge from the most unexpected sources when given the opportunity to flourish. The evening that had begun as Chef Dubois's demonstration of superiority became a landmark moment in culinary history, remembered not for his classical technique, but for Isabella's revelation that sophistication, authenticity, and excellence could emerge from traditions that existed outside formal recognition. Her victory changed not just her own life, but the entire conversation about who deserved respect, recognition, and opportunity within the American culinary landscape, proving that sometimes the most extraordinary talents are hiding in plain sight, waiting only for the courage to step forward and claim their rightful place in the professional kitchen. Want to hear more incredible stories of hidden talents and unexpected triumphs? Subscribe to our channel for weekly tallies that will surprise and inspire you.